I've always been a fan of things people call cult hits, works that, for one reason or another, never catch on with a large audience and instead find a small but dedicated following. This could be due to a number of reasons: obscure subject matter, poor marketing, or the creators are intentionally going against the grain of what people are used to in favor of just making something different. For whatever reason, it usually means two things: they didn't make a lot of money, and they're much more fascinating to talk about than the ones that did. This can apply to all sorts of mediums: TV shows like Twin Peaks, movies like Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, and of course we have cult hit video games. In a medium as unique as games, developers can create all sorts of strange and interesting experiences for players. Some of my favorite games are ones people would call cult hits, like Okage, Hotline Miami, Nier, and Catherine. There's just something I find appealing about media created specifically to be unique and different instead of copying the same beats as the latest hot trend. No, that does not make me a hipster. I don't even drink coffee. Sometimes these projects are able to reach enough success to continue on, like with Disgaea. Most of them, however, are just one-off projects that manage to garner enough of a following to be remembered. Then you have the games that seem perfectly designed to become cult hits and just never really find their audience. That's the case with today's game, Okage Shadow King, a very strange and offbeat PS2 exclusive from October 2001, developed by a group named Xenierworks with help from Sony as not only the studio's first big title, but the only game they've made that was released outside of Japan. I've not heard many people talk about Okage outside of a few passing comments in largely unrelated videos. Reviews from critics of the time were a bit mixed, but mostly on the positive side. It even got re-released on PS4, so clearly there's some love for this game, just not enough to really take notice. With all that being said, let's pop it in the PS2 and see what it's like in the court of the Shadow King. Get it? Like the King Crimson album. Right off the bat, I love this intro screen. It has all these little guides hinting at how the world works, a diorama of sorts spinning in the background to show the world's strange architecture, and if you wait for a bit, a cinematic plays which is appropriately weird and intriguing. Trust me when I say this is just a sign of things to come. It opens with the main character's mother in the kitchen singing a song about herself before asking the protagonist to go pick up some bread, despite some clearly being visible on the shelf behind her. We're allowed to name the hero, but I'm just gonna keep it as Ari. One of the first things I noticed is that the world feels very unusual. Your house looks run down with cobwebs and boarded up doors. Your sister is apparently dating multiple boys after reading your mother's book titled Controlling Guys Made Easy. It turns out a ghost is haunting the village's water tank. Even your childhood friend makes you invite her to the circus just to tell you she already has a date. Play almost any other JRPG, especially for the time, and you expect to wake up in some ideal little storybook village, but Tanel just feels like some sleepy podunk place in the boonies. Ari's mom, little sister, and childhood friend aren't these shining beacons of unrealistic wholesomeness and purity. They are blatantly selfish and manipulative gold diggers. A little ways into the game, Julia tells Ari that she doesn't like him anymore because he no longer seems like the type to not complain when she feeds him leftover cold potatoes for dinner or spends all their money on shopping. It's ironically refreshing to see someone this openly terrible. In case it isn't obvious yet, Okage is very heavy on humor and subverting typical JRPG tropes for the sake of comedy, almost to the point I'd consider it a parody. Even the setup for the adventure is wacky. Later that night, Ari walks off to the circus just to realize he missed it, and he sees his sister being attacked by a ghost. He brings her back home only to realize the terrible fate his sister has been cursed to speak only Pig Latin. Even though the doctor says her life isn't in any danger, the dad acts like we have to sign our souls over to a demon to cure her, and he just so happens to have a mysterious pink bottle said to contain one. It's almost like he was waiting for any excuse to mess with it. So he does a silly little dance and out pops the ultimate ancient evil king, Lord Stanley Hi-Hat Trinidad the 14th. Or Stan for short. Again, it's pretty clear this game wants to make you laugh with its strange sense of humor, what with the cursed almighty supreme evil shadow man being named Stan. Stan is not a name to be feared. It's the name of that guy from accounting who never shows up to work early enough to get the good donuts. Even the other villagers don't take him seriously, they just think he's a party trick Ari's doing with his shadow. He agrees to cure Ari's sister in exchange for possessing Ari's shadow to start his world conquest, and Ari's family is totally okay with selling him out. You are all terrible people. So he does just that, but turns her shadow pink, which he never said he wouldn't do, to be fair. Then he gets a map of pretenders to his throne from the circus ringleader and sets out into the world to defeat all the wannabe evil kings and reclaim his power. That's the setup. You're playing as a literally overshadowed boy with no real qualities worth mentioning, possessed by an ancient evil, and travels the land because, well, really just because he says so. Hey, he cured your sister of Piglet, and you might as well help him with world conquest. It's the least you can do. It isn't long before you encounter more party members, such as the hero Rosalind, who's actively seeking out Stan so he can cure her own pink shadow, and Professor Kissling, a 45-year-old scientist obsessed with researching the paranormal. Which I guess is just normal in this world? It's also worth mentioning that the professor's profile says he uses his research as an excuse to follow around young girls. Not exactly your ho-hum JRPG party, but that's one of the many questionably fun quirks about this game that sets it apart from other entries in the genre. You aren't traveling the land with your cute childhood friend and a stoic older warrior. Instead, you have a straight-laced hero with a chip on her shoulder and an old creep who looks like this. Even the problems you tackle aren't very big deals in comparison to other stories. Most of the evil kings aren't even really doing anything. You fight the sewer evil king because, well, he's there. You fight the bubble evil king because he kidnaps the princess, but he didn't have a plan of what to do with her in the first place, he just did it. For the longest time, I was wondering why they felt so unthreatening and inconsequential, and while I eventually got an explanation, at the moment I just thought it was kind of funny. Like, you're wandering around the world to take on things that should be way more menacing, but then you fight a fat rat who's actively looking for people that like punk music and have a positive personality. That is Okage's biggest strength, the writing and the humor. It's very silly and almost seems like it's taking the piss out of JRPG cliches, and that's a sense of humor I can appreciate. Several of the things they poke fun at are still present in modern games, like the mute protagonist as well as the aforementioned unbelievable female characters. It's nice to have a game like this come along and shake things up for the sake of comedy, especially when you're familiar with the genre and what they're lampooning. That's not to say the tropes and parodies are inherently bad, they can be fine if handled well, but when you see so many of the same cliches in different games, it's refreshing to see a title do the exact opposite in a successful way. At the same time, I don't think you need to be a fan of JRPGs to get some enjoyment out of this game's humor. A lot of it relies on silly exchanges between party members and even some NPC dialogue. I don't think I've been as interested in talking to NPCs as I was with this game in quite a while. Most characters have something interesting to say, which caught my attention every time. Of course, I didn't want to go out of my way to talk to everyone, but it was nice to get some funny dialogue if I ever bothered to do so. There's a status ailment called tax, which reduces your pay at the end of battle, which you can cure with a write-off charm. I don't think I ever actually got hit by that. Bosses give you components to an ancient, mysterious relic known as a voice recorder. There's just straight-up cholesterol in a treasure chest in the game. I don't know what it's for, it's just there. There are loads of stuff like that throughout this game, and I found them pretty funny for the most part. Humor is incredibly subjective though, and what I find amusing might not tickle your funny bones, so if the game's jokes don't mesh with you, I can't imagine you'd get much enjoyment out of the experience. It's mostly built on humor, at least until much later in the game. Foreshadowing, which is actually a pun in this case. So far the story has been about a possessed kid and his ragtag group going around and beating up debatably worthwhile bad guys. Something significant happens once you beat the second evil king though. When you get to the dock town of Rashello, which is literally just built on a bunch of docks, there's a princess named Marlene who gets kidnapped because she's the princess. Stan is all for going to rescue her, but just for his own nefarious deeds. So you delve into the first dungeon and save Princess Marlene from absolutely nothing. Once Stan tries to test out his mind control powers, he realizes they don't work on Marlene because it only works on those with a soul. Wait, what? And now, just because she wants to, the princess joins your group and claims Ari as her new servant/property. Oh, I can tell we're gonna get along swimmingly. It was at this point in my playthrough where I started to notice something strange. Not with the game itself, the whole thing is meant to be strange, but with my personal experience playing it. Everything was going fine, I was making progress, I hadn't encountered any big hurdles so far, and yet there was some odd feeling in my mind I just couldn't shake. Once Marlene was introduced, I finally figured it out. It was disinterest. I didn't feel like I wanted to continue the game, which was odd because at this point, I hadn't been playing for very long. What I experienced so far kept me interested, but for some reason I just didn't want to continue through the story. I think a part of that might have been due to how point A to B the game was feeling, or how flat the story is in regards to the actual plot. Sure, on paper it sounds funny, and the dialogue was amusing for the most part, but nothing really happened so far that managed to hook me in after the premise was established to the point where I absolutely had to see what would happen next. Princess Marlene joining the party at least added something to the quirky cast. I was genuinely interested in what Stan meant about her not having a soul, and there is a pretty nice sequence right after the second dungeon where you go back home and learn that Marlene isn't as stuck up as she lets on. But then your next task is to go find the next evil king and the routine starts going again. It was such an odd conflict for me. I didn't feel interested in going through the rest of the game, but they continued to present aspects and scenes I enjoyed that made me compelled to stick around. I really started enjoying the story later on, but for a good half to 2/3 of the game, I felt like I was just floating around and waiting for things to happen. If there's one thing that kept me interested enough to continue Okage, it's the game's visuals. Okage has one of the most unique and striking visual styles I've ever seen in JRPGs, possibly any game I've played up until now. There's a clear inspiration from Henry Selick, the person who actually directed The Nightmare Before Christmas. No, Tim Burton didn't direct it, he just wrote the story. Your childhood is a filthy lie. The characters look warped and peculiar, having odd body proportions and bizarre texturing that makes them resemble puppets or stop-motion dolls, or eggs in some cases. Their jerky movements and cutscenes might be due to budget restrictions, but I think it adds to the almost uncanny atmosphere given off by the world around you. Come to think of it, the whole game's tone of taking these spooky concepts and translating them into a more lighthearted story is a bit like Nightmare Before Christmas. Like, there's a cliff near Rochello that looks very similar to Jack's tree in the pumpkin patch. That can't be a coincidence. The architecture is similarly bizarre, with walls and corners forming strange angles that look like something that can't actually exist. It reminds me, of course, of Nightmare, but going further back to German expressionism films in the early 20th century. It makes the journey feel so surreal and theatrical, which is a big reason why I think this is such an interesting game. If there's one way the presentation falls short, oddly enough, it's the world design. I do like how the environments look at first, even if the game doesn't sport a very interesting color palette, but man, does it get repetitive. It's not even because they made it all look odd. It simply gets stale. The fact the game only has about 5 areas to explore, which you keep going back to over and over again, should say enough. Even for a 25-30 hour game, it got old pretty quick. The game has you return to Madril more than anywhere else, and while it's funny having this heavily industrialized town just kind of floating above a dark pit filled with gears and smoke, while everywhere else is natural and verdant, it's still really small and its color palette consists of mostly grays and browns. I got sick of walking around here by my 3rd visit, and that was far from the last time I had to go there. It's a shame the towns are so small and most of the world is taken up by flat, empty space. I wanted to see more oddball buildings and the kind of people who live there because that was one of my favorite parts of exploring. There just really isn't enough of it in my opinion. I'm someone who's always disliked the focus on highly detailed graphics over unique aesthetics, so playing through such a weird looking game felt very refreshing even though it's 21 years old. Same thing with Katamari Damacy. Aesthetics matter more than graphical power, everyone. Just looking at some of the concept and promotional art is really cool with the scratchy line work and dour colors, while the characters look so cartoony. It even continues into the instruction manual, which is a massive improvement over Guardian's Crusade. It resembles a journal with all sorts of great drawings and details, with the wording being very similar to what you find in-game. There are all these little sketches of monsters and bits that look like torn off pages taped inside. It's pretty neat. I always appreciate effort like this, especially since we don't get manuals in games anymore. So yeah, love the visuals in Okage, even if it produces some very unsettling results. It's just a shame that the soundtrack doesn't really hold up in comparison to the visual presentation. Like I said in my previous video on Guardian's Crusade, I'm not a big music person, so my opinion may not mean much here, but I'm struggling to remember any tunes in this game. They just kind of blended into the background without catching my attention, which is disappointing considering the unique aesthetic. Even as I go back and listen to its score, I can't for the life of me remember where exactly in the game I heard each song, unlike in Guardians Crusade where I felt each song was memorable. Man, I'm bringing up Guardians Crusade a lot. Go play Guardians Crusade. The only track I can sort of recall is the battle music, but that's probably because I heard it so often rather than it's particularly good. I do think a handful of the songs had some nice atmosphere, but once I moved on to the next scene, they left my mind completely. All of those complaints are small potatoes in comparison to my overall biggest problem with Okage. The combat. It's bad. Like, I don't even have a segue for this, it just straight up sucks cacti. Despite my issues so far, which are more things I believe the game could have done better rather than things I think are outright bad, the combat is downright awful, which I do think could make or break your experience if you decide to play this. It's similar to the older Final Fantasy games' active time battle system, where characters act once their meters are full rather than wait for their turn like civilized combatants. You have basic attacks, items to use, as well as skills you learn throughout the game. Skills can cost HP or LP, the latter of which apparently stands for labor points? What, are we forming a union and seizing the means of experience production? Once a character's bar is filled, you can pick what they do. Once you choose what you want the character to do, they will execute that action at some point. It took me a while to figure out why the combat wasn't clicking for me, to the point where I was just getting frustrated. See, in old Final Fantasy games like 6 and the like, characters would perform an action fast. Give them a command, they do that command not too long after. In Okage, it feels like the characters will do what you want whenever they feel like it. They'll check their schedule and get back to you. The animations might have something to do with that. They take so long to jump over to their target, wind up their attack, perform a multi-second combo, then jump back into position. And that's just for basic attacks. Go into their skills and they feel they need to stop everything else just to show their dumb little dance instead of getting on with it and smacking a monster in the face. They can't even replicate the ATB system well, since all time freezes once a character can act, which removes a lot of the tense energy in this style of battle system, to the point where I honestly think going straight up turn-based would have made it a lot better. I hear people say turn-based combat is dull and outdated, but I think most of the people who say that would take turn-based over whatever Okage is trying to do. The sluggishness is what really bothers me. Your party starts a battle going first and being responsive, but the action bars outrun the actual pace of combat as a whole, so by the time you select an action and get placed on the stack, it could take 2, 3, maybe 5 other turns before your character actually uses that action. This isn't helped by the large enemy swarms you're often placed against, with some fights having nearly 10 opponents and bringing the battle to a screeching halt while you wait to pick away at all of them. If I could just pick an action that happened immediately, it would at least make the order more comprehensible. I'm sure there's some Okage superfan out there who replays the game every month waiting to comment how stupid I am and how the combat is incredibly easy, but this battle system isn't complex at all. It's slow and clunky. It also feels cheap at points, with enemies randomly dishing out high damage out of nowhere. I specifically remember enemies in the last dungeon where Ari could be at near full health and the enemies would just kill him and erase all my progress. No, that's just annoying. It especially stunk when I was ready to heal a party member only for the target to die because there were 3 actions ahead of what I just picked. There were times when I thought I almost had a handle on how combat works, but a few battles later I accepted the fact that it was a fruitless effort and the game just did whatever it felt like. I'm not sure if there's some way to better understand the combat, but I honestly think if I did get how it runs battles, I still wouldn't have enjoyed it. Even when you get more party members in the form of Big Bull and Linda later on, it never felt like combat was something I actively wanted to do instead of something I was putting up with for the sake of continuing the story. I will say though, adding Big Bull to the party was such a relief because he's an absolute tank and hits like a truck. As soon as I got him, he took Kisling's spot in the party because Kisling is frankly just useless. The boss fights were extremely hit and miss for me. They always felt either too easy or complete baloney. The best designed boss battle in the game is probably Big Bull, where he has 4 bull minions casting this game's equivalent of silence. What's really interesting about how it applies certain status ailments is that they have levels, and each time you're hit with one, it takes an ability away. If you're at level 1, you can't use LP skills, level 2 takes away HP skills, and level 3 takes up your access to items. Having this constant threat of losing your skills as the fight progresses while also needing to handle all 5 enemies simultaneously makes the fight pretty tense. There's nothing as rewarding as finally making that run where you win, even if it feels like bullcrap at times. I swear I had to play through this boss fight like 10 times before I won, and sometimes it felt like I lost due to a run of awful luck along with the previously mentioned clunky flow of combat. The rest of the boss fights are either laughably easy or frustrating due to all the irritating minions the boss brought along. The dungeons themselves fare a little better, but not by much. The first one, which I didn't even reach until a few hours in, consists of a single floor where you walk around a small room and destroy 4 jars before facing the boss. I was worried all the dungeons would be like that, but most of them are actually pretty neat to explore and have some gimmicks that make navigating them a bit more fun. Unfortunately, all those gimmicks are just ways to locate jars and destroy them, but you know, credit where credit's due. Even if they're okay, they aren't all that noteworthy except for one. There's a dungeon that's only 2 floors, but the first floor being a small maze of rotating path tiles and the second being broken into 3 segments. You have to rotate each path to get to the next section of the dungeon's second floor, with the first 2 giving you a gear to fix some of the path tiles. You then solve the path in order to reach the boss. It's actually a pretty neat trick, although I will call shenanigans on them, not just climbing over the barrier and walking straight to the end. It's like maybe 2 inches high. Come on, guys. Speaking of that specific dungeon, there's a pretty big twist at the end of it, and honestly, it's where my favorite part of the game starts. Despite my complaints about the combat, I do think the story is pretty great, so if you want to experience it yourself, skip to the time on screen now. Ready? Okay. At the end of this dungeon is something called a magic square, which is actually a triangle within a circle, and it's said to unlock the power of whoever stands on it. So Stan has Ari do just that. There's a flash of light and Ari becomes transparent. The rest of the group starts talking about finding the evil king and not even acknowledging their friend's existence when he tries to reply. After a bit, they walk away and leave Ari by himself. What's happening here? You go out into the overworld and for some reason can't call upon Stan. He's gone, just like the rest of the party. The villagers ignore you, the innkeeper doesn't seem to notice you, and ghosts don't come after you in the overworld anymore. The music becomes supremely melancholy, and eventually Ari comes to the revelation that he's all alone. Everyone's forgotten about him, or acts like he never existed to begin with. You try to talk to people and they speak like something entirely different has been going on, with Stan conquering the world and Rosalind being the only one to fight back. At first, I thought this was a joke because Ari is described as someone who gets overshadowed easily. Maybe the magic square that's a triangle within a circle made him more unnoticeable, and there's some sort of solution that'll set us all back on track in no time. But that's not what happens. No, you have to travel to the end of the Snowlands to find a strange walled-off city called Trist, where you're greeted by a peculiar woman named KT. Like the letters. Okay, that's kind of cute. You hear this is the town of those similar to how Ari is now. People forgotten by the rest of the world to the point others don't even notice their existence. A sanctuary of the disregarded, as KT says, including the circus ringmaster from the start of the game who gave you the map of fake evil kings. He said he'd be forgotten, and here he is. This is easily my absolute favorite part of Okage. It's so melancholy and mysterious. The idea of living a life being disregarded by others is both tragic and strangely relatable. I think everyone's been in that headspace before where it feels like no matter what you do, no one can pay you any mind. The idea where you could be completely abandoned by the rest of the world as no one hears your voice or even sees you for yourself. It's a very remarkable sentiment to see in what up until now was a more comedy-focused game, but it's fascinating nonetheless. Exploring around town, we hear about a girl who's been here since the very creation of Trist, doing nothing but crying in her room and wandering around like she's looking for something important. Going into the back alley, we can clearly hear someone call out, but they don't seem to respond. Speaking to Block the ringleader, he says we need to go out into the world and try to strengthen our voice through interaction. Once our presence is strong enough, we'll return to normal and he can use a spell to bring everything back to how it was before. Ah yes, the ultimate solution to bizarre magical body transformations. Conversation therapy. What does that mean? Well, nothing much. You just need to go out and talk to every NPC in the world. Kind of. Your actual goal is to participate in 30 conversations. You need to walk up, talk to 30 NPCs, pick a different response each time. It's a very tedious task, and I don't even have a joke for it. It's just kind of boring. Once you return to Madril for the 17th time, there's a cutscene that shows Marlene and her butler, Balloon. When we follow them into the hotel, it shows how she vaguely remembers going on a different adventure than the one she's currently embarking on. She feels she had a separate adventure with someone important, and she just can't remember why or how. Then Balloon gives us a very unsubtle close-up about how she shouldn't remember him and the boy should have disappeared from this world. So, if you wanted to know who's behind it all, it's the butler. Didn't know we were going by whodunit rules. It takes a while, but eventually Ari speaks with enough people and we return to the city of Trist for Block's help. Stan returns, telling Ari how he was just about to fight Rosalind, and then the Phantom Evil King appears to say how Block was actually an evil king who betrayed Phantom by helping Ari. So that's cool. Once that business is finished and everyone gets back together, something really crazy happens. We return to Ari's house only to see Marlene being force-choked by Balloon. So this is where the story takes a massive turn from goofy spooky parody to something more weirdly serious. Balloon reveals this world is actually a fake one separated from the real world through the power of something called classification. And the Marlene we know is actually a doll created in her image to live with him in this world when the real Marlene disappeared in this fantasy realm. Yes, this whole world, even though it's very small, and everything the residents have known for who knows how long, is just a massive playroom for the real Marlene. Going even further, this power of classification also dictates what everyone does, from ordinary villagers to heroes like Rosalind. They were all assigned a role by Balloon and can only play out that part in his daughter's safe world of adventure. Except for Ari. For one reason or another, Ari is capable of functioning without an assigned role, and his actions have been ruining Balloon's perfectly dictated world, to the point where he even kills the fake Marlene. To Balloon, she's no longer the perfect obedient daughter carrying out her role as princess. Before disappearing, Balloon claims to prepare a powerful foe that will defeat the party once and for all. That's quite a shift from what's been happening so far, and while I'm not entirely sure it works with the context of this game's tone, it's a very interesting choice. It also gives context to earlier parts of the story. This world was sanctioned off so his daughter could have safe adventures, so the evil kings being fairly inconsequential makes a lot more sense. It's definitely one of those twists that make you look for hints on repeat playthroughs. Looking back on this part of the story, it reminds me of BioShock, weirdly enough. No major spoilers for a massively successful 15-year-old game, but one of the major aspects of its narrative was toying with the idea of how the player interacts with a game's story in general. Using dialogue and well-established ideas of how someone progresses in a game, they gave a shocking realization that made you question your actual role in the experience. That's a very simplified explanation for what happened. Go watch one of those 8-hour in-depth breakdowns if you'd like to know more. But this does feel like a similar concept done 6 years prior, just in a different way. Now, after this awesome, shocking, impressive twist that brings about all these philosophical talking points and questions, we have to go through the worst dungeon in the game. Yep, it drops off that quickly. The Deep Grave Pit isn't bad in the same way as other poorly designed JRPG dungeons. It doesn't have awful or confusing designs, it isn't stuffed with monster closets or starve you for items. No, it's just 9 floors deep, which, for context, the longest dungeon up to this point had 4 floors. It doesn't even have clever navigation gimmicks, it's just 8 floors of destroying urns and then finding a doll at the bottom. A doll you place in an empty treasure chest on another floor to open a secret room that gives you a key to the real next dungeon. How you're supposed to know that, I have no idea. It's a good thing all dungeons have a save point at the start, or this would be an even worse slog than it already is. The next dungeon is literally just one room, and it's a boss fight with the Phantom Evil King from earlier. Once you beat him and transport the next location, he joins the party, so that's cool. I mean, he isn't particularly useful, but, still neat. Chapter 6 takes place in this really fantastic location called the Highlands, which has all of this super warped geography. Again, I really like the environments in this game when they show off its unique art style. Here you meet a vampire with Really unfortunate teeth. I guess Balloon never classified someone as a dentist. A short fight with the vampire later, and suddenly a bridge appears on the edge of the Highlands, leading you to the final dungeon of the game, the World Library. It's okay, you're basically wandering around looking for keys, but there are some neat bits of lore here that give a clearer idea of how this adventure came to be. You come across some old guys who are there to help sort the classifications of the world, and there's talk of a man named Pollock who long ago made an attempt to break Balloon's world, which eventually led to Ari's ability to not be classified. Which, now that I think about it, the bottle Stan was in was called Pollock's bottle. I finally reach Balloon, and he reiterates how much Ari has ruined his world by not conforming to his ironclad classifications. Again, it feels like there's a lot to analyze when it comes to the story of this game, and I really like that. I have no doubt there's some super detailed multi-hour video essay picking apart every aspect of this game's narrative, but it also feels like one of those stories you can interpret in a number of different ways. Personally, I see it as fighting against the rigid structure of society.
You know, we're living in a society. We're supposed to act in a civilized way.
Ever since the beginning of human civilization, certain paradigms and expectations have been placed upon people by those around them. Parents, teachers, peers, basically everyone sees people within certain categories despite how unique a single person is. Some people may be fine living within those constraints, whereas others might find them too restraining and want to live their lives how they please. I think Balloon represents those who only see the world working within these confines, even if they have what they believe are the best intentions, and doesn't tolerate anything that steps outside of them. Meanwhile, Ari and his friends show the freedom of living how one chooses, even if it goes against the set ways of society. That's just how I like to see it. On a completely unrelated note, trans rights. If you played this game and have a different interpretation, leave it in the comments, I'd really like to know. Balloon is so obsessed with keeping the world how he wants, he forces Stan and Rosalind to battle one another in accordance with their roles as the hero and villain. He even gives Stan a body, which does not look like how I expected. Nice suit, dude. Fortunately, we're able to use the ancient power of the legendary voice recorder to restore them back to normal, and the final fight begins. With all their friendship and power combined, the party gets their butts handed to them on a silver platter. Oh, this is one of those bosses, isn't it? You know, the ones where there's such a massive jump in power from the previous one, it's basically forcing you to spend several hours of grinding just to see the end. I could have done just that, but that would mean I have to do more combat, so I had to find a faster solution. My first instinct was to whip out the old Game Shark disc in hopes there was some kind of max level cheat. I know I did this with Yanya Cabalista, and I don't mean to make it a habit, but man, the battle system is awful. It feels like something Sam himself would encourage, so I'm fine with this. While I did find some codes, my disc sadly doesn't work anymore and freezes when I try to enter them, so now I had to find another solution. My best bet now was to grind for an item called Black Cat Jewels, which have the HP of everyone in battle, and they're only dropped by one enemy in the Deep Grave Pit. So what do? I spend an hour and a half running around this tiny room waiting for these jerk screws to show up, which are basically the golden hands from Persona, except a lot worse. Every time I had the chance, not only did my party deal pitiful damage, but they just ran away. Stop that, I'm just trying to kill you. So, knowing this was a fruitless effort, I executed my last choice available. I did some grinding and raised my party up 10 levels. How long did it take? A bit over 3 hours. 3 hours of running around this boring dungeon, repeating the same actions with this clunky combat system, always worried about the possibility of a random enemy smacking Ari to death and making me lose all of my progress. But I eventually did it, so I took on the boss again, and it still took a whopping 20 minutes. Jeez. Once you defeat Balloon, he walks off, seemingly to find his daughter, when all of a sudden the castle crumbles as our heroes make their escape. Watching from a nearby cliff, the group discusses what they want to do now that their world is no longer classified, which mostly just means they go back to doing whatever they were already doing. It's kind of hilarious how they just leave Ari alone and he walks back home. We then see the town of Trist, where the people are finally able to speak to each other and are ready to return to the real world, including a young girl who looks awfully familiar. When Ari returns to his village, everyone's setting up for their regular festival and acting like nothing happened. Once he gets home, he sees the real Marlene is there, who joins him in, I suppose, happily ever after. Until Stan shows up in a post-credit scene to possess Ari again. Kinda feels like they're setting up to a sequel, but it unfortunately never got one. Okage is an interesting experience. On one hand, it has a lot of good qualities to it. The art style is eye-catching, the characters have plenty of fun interactions with each other, and the story has some very thought-provoking ideas behind it that make it feel much deeper than most games I've played in quite a while, let alone one released in the year 2001. On the other hand, the gameplay part of this Japanese role-playing game is cold hot dog water in a rusty skillet, and the fact my first idea for beating the final boss was to cheat or cheese my way through rather than slog through more hours of combat probably says more than the several paragraphs I wrote complaining about the battle system. On the other hand, which if you do have one, it's your doctor, I don't think I've experienced a game with this kind of atmosphere, and I just know there's an audience out there who would absolutely love playing through it. Not only that, but I'm pretty sure there are some secrets or pieces of conversations that I didn't see or experience, so I'm sure I'd get even more out of it if I played through it again. Will I play through it again? No, probably not. The thing about Okage is, while I think it has a lot of strong qualities, actually playing through the game itself is a bit of a massive slog. If this were an adventure game, where all I had to do was read dialogue and explore the world, this would have a massive 2 thumbs up for me, no questions asked. But because the combat is clunky, awkward, and so incredibly frustrating, I'm honestly hesitant to recommend playing through it. So here's my best solution. If what you see on screen intrigues you, it's currently available on PS4 for just $10. If the combat starts getting on your nerves, just boot up an emulator, use a cheat code to make everyone OP, because I do think there's something really enjoyable here, buried under all that awkward jank. This game is something special, and I strongly recommend it, even if I have to tack on a number of caveats. Maybe one day this game can truly find its audience, and will no longer be classified to obscurity. That pun is going to make no sense if you didn't see the spoiler section.